Hello, I'm Tom Bradby. Welcome to Talking Politics. Robert and Anushka are with me today and every Wednesday to dig into the issues dominating the political agenda. Top of the list this week was grooming gangs and Elon Musk's continued interference in UK politics. Well, I'm joined by Robert and Anushka, who are here to discuss all of that and much more. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
Blimey, it's got off to a racing start, 2025. Why did we think it was going to be any different? Like, we're 1 and a bit weeks in and we've already had about 50 humongous news stories in the first Donald Trump press conference. Maybe we should start with the obvious thing, Musk's kind of comments which have lit up British politics. I think the thing that's been difficult for a lot of us is the very abusive comments to Jess Phillips. Now, Jess Phillips has been following this story as closely as any of the sort of politicians at Westminster over the last decade and more. She's a lifelong campaigner for, the rights and for justice for women, particularly who've been the victims of sexual violence. And here is a very rich guy on the other side of the world insulting her in the most egregious terms. I mean, that was just difficult for a lot of people to take, wasn't it?
I mean, it was pretty extraordinary. Yeah, of all the people to suggest weren't doing enough, Jess Phillips is not one who you would pick because, as you say, she spent much of her professional career basically
She told you yesterday, she's literally sat there with the victims of grooming gangs in police stations.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose you have to separate this out, which is the criticism starts with this particular thing to do with the Oldham inquiry, which I'll just come to, but it goes towards a woman who basically, yes, has constantly supported victims, including of this scandal, the Telford victims. One of the things she told me about this week was her own work with the Telford victims, where she initially did also agree that there should be a national inquiry specifically on this. But what she felt she learned, or this was her justification when she spoke to me, was that actually a locally led inquiry was much more effective and actually has led to changes already. Whilst the national inquiry we've had on child sexual exploitation, we're still waiting for those recommendations to come into place. The actual issue was that Oldham Council wanted a second local inquiry, but they wanted the Home Office to run the inquiry into what had happened in Oldham. They had asked for that because that's what the victims had wanted from Oldham, and they felt that the Home Office would give them more power, although it is worth saying that Jess Phillips' letter back to Oldham Council is actually quite supportive. It says you should have a locally led inquiry. She's defended that position this week, and I've spoken to quite a lot of people in the council as well. They're pretty satisfied with that position and they're going ahead and setting up that inquiry.
I mean, if I were Musk or indeed Kemi Badenoch or Nigel Farage, what I might have focused on is the fact that we have these important recommendations from a national inquiry, by Professor J into systematic child abuse, not just by gangs of Pakistani origin, but in the church. I mean, let's be absolutely clear. We had decades of younger people not being protected from hideous sexual violence, right? And we've got these really important recommendations, none of which have been properly implemented. Now, we did get the Home Secretary the other day, I think under pressure because of the furore around the issue of whether we need another inquiry, at last saying there will now be a legal duty on any professional who is told of child abuse to report it to the authorities, report it to the police. Thank goodness that is going to happen at last, but it's still months away. I was talking to people involved in that inquiry. They said to me, which I think is completely reasonable, and this is something that, again, I'm amazed there's no sort of national outcry about. They say, it's great that we've got a minister who looks after veterans. Why haven't we got a minister whose responsibility it is to make sure that all the proper protections are in place for victims or potential victims of child abuse? Why haven't we got these new organisations that the inquiry has asked for England and Wales? These new institutions that would be devoted exclusively to protecting these people. Why isn't there a debate about another recommendation in the report about whether compensation should be paid to some of these victims? The scandal, I think, is that 2 years ago we had the report and we still haven't had its recommendations. Now, I think that is a scandal. It's a scandal, actually, that to an extent should be laid at the previous government's door. But this is a government that's been in office, right, since July, and none of it's happened yet, right? So, the fact that we're having an argument about, I'm not saying that there might not be a case for another review, particularly of the grooming gangs issue. But the bigger scandal is we've had a review and protections have not yet been put in place.
I did put that, by the way, to Jess Phillips and said, why does it take Elon Musk intervening for you to actually bring forward any recommendations? Because separate to the ones Robert mentioned, they obviously have brought forward one of the recommendations, which is that people will face potentially criminal sanctions if they fail to protect children or fail to pass on information about child sexual exploitation.
But that's still months away from actually happening.
Yeah, I mean, her response, just a couple of things on her response. First of all, can I just say she was physically and emotionally so affected by this. She said to us it had turned her life upside down. I mean, the stress was obviously just off the charts. She said, to some extent, this is ridiculous. What he's saying is ridiculous. I don't even want to respond to it. And then she wakes up to the reality that he has hundreds of millions of followers who are seeing what he has
211
said. Now, she got
million followers.
Not angry, but she got quite kind of robust when I said, you're only doing any of this because of Elon Musk now. And she said the minute she came in, the first thing she did was say it was a disgrace that the Alexis J recommendations hadn't been put in place, and that she then set up a cross-party committee to try and work towards that. But there is no doubt that it has been speeded up by the intervention of Elon Musk. Alexis J, who did that original report, has said the same. And I do think that is, a crying shame. But I do also think there's a hell of a lot of politics going on here over an issue which we have covered for years and years and years, and we have had inquiries.
Just on that point, right? Why isn't Robert Jenrick is making, some would say, a perfectly reasonable point about there not being enough protection for young people from these awful gangs. Why aren't they making a fuss about the church? I mean, I don't think we can be confident, given recent events, that actually that is fully, properly reformed and under control. Why is there not a Tory party outcry about all of that?
Well, it was the first PMQs of 2025 today, and Kemi Badenoch started the year with a series of questions about the grooming gangs scandal.
Leader of the opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
The new year has started with a focus on the decades-long rape gang scandal. Across the country, thousands of girls were tortured and sexually abused at the hands of men who treated them as things to be used and disposed of, destroying many lives forever. The Prime Minister has mentioned previous inquiries. He is right. There has been an inquiry into child sexual abuse, but it wasn't about the rape gang scandal.
There have been a number of inquiries, some of them localised, including the Mayor of Manchester's inquiry recently, and of course a national inquiry Professor J carried out, took 7 years, had 20 recommendations, none of which actually were implemented by the party opposite when they were in government.
I'm shocked that the Prime Minister would say that actions were not taken. He knows full well that we accepted 18. He knows full well that we accepted 18 of the 20 recommendations in the J inquiry and went further, launching a gangs task force that found 550 more perpetrators.
Mr. Speaker, she says they accepted the recommendations. They didn't act on them. Exactly. One of the central recommendations was mandatory reporting, and it still hasn't been enacted. I called for this 11 years ago. They've been tweeting and talking. We've been acting.
He knows that as a minister, I would not have been speaking on this specific issue. I was not a Home Office minister, but Mr. Speaker, But, Mr. Speaker, I will remind him about other victims who came to me who I did help. The victims of the Tavistock scandal who came to me as a minister. I didn't send them away like his safeguarding minister. I made sure, as his Labour Party were calling me transphobic, that we launched the CAS review, which even his health secretary has accepted. So we do right by victims, Mr. Speaker. The reason why a national inquiry is important is because this issue is systemic. It has been involving local and national officials, the police, prosecutors and politicians.
I accept that victims and survivors are in different places on this. Those that I've spoken to are worried about the delay of a further inquiry. The last inquiry took 7 years. That would take us to 2031. Now, these inquiries, amongst the issues that's been raised with me, and if she's been speaking to victims, they'll have raised this with her, is that it's very hard for victims and survivors to come forward to explain what's happened to them. They do not want to be rushed through this process, which is why the last one took 7 years. It's not sensible to suggest that this can be done in a hurry, on the cheap and comprehensively. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, that would take us to, let's say, 2030, 2031. The victims that I've spoken to want action today. I agree with them on that.
Sir Roger Gale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, setting aside the matter of grooming gangs, the opposition amendment on the order paper today sets out very clearly why the bill that we shall be debating is so very deeply flawed. And if it is to become an Act of Parliament, it will have to be completely rewritten in committee. But, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister from that dispatch box has made much of his service as the public prosecutor. So could he tell the House in that capacity why during his time he declined to instigate a prosecution for rape and sexual abuse against Mohammed Fayed?
Prime Minister.
That case never crossed my desk.
Interestingly, right at the end there, that question about Fayed, which the Prime Minister clearly wasn't expecting, a bit of a revelation, I would say, that it never crossed his desk. Maybe we did know that. But
no, I thought we did. I thought we did know that. I thought, because I think he has been pushed on that before. Now, I mean, there is something slightly odd about the fact we do know the police, investigated on multiple occasions that the Crown Prosecution Service had no knowledge of it. That is odd, and I don't think this story is going away. Do you?
No, and he should be asking why did it not come across his desk?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like there's an awful lot yet to discover about what really went on there, particularly given the scale of it. Earlier on, obviously, the exchanges between Kemi Badenoch and the Prime Minister were about the question of another national inquiry into the grooming gangs. There was quite a few references to a vote this afternoon. You may be listening to this later in the week, in which case it will have passed, about the education bill, to put it simply. I don't think we need to get too detained with that, do we? Because basically the point is the Tories have lots of reasons of opposing that bill. Yes, they've stuck on a point about calling for an independent inquiry. It probably will go through the bill, and by the time you're listening to this, it probably will have gone through. So should we just park that? Because I don't really think, or do any of you want to?
Well, I just think it's just like the politics of it all, right? Basically, it's just, we don't need to dwell on it too long, but basically the children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill is passing through Parliament. And I actually have always thought it's a slightly odd bill, because on the one hand, it's dealing with things that happen in the Sarah Sharif case, like setting up a register for children who are not in school, saying that you can't automatically homeschool your child if there's a child protection order. On the other hand, it's taking away the old thing that the Tories put in place, where you force schools into academisation if they are failing. And the Tories really hate that bit of it. And so they've put down an amendment on second reading of the bill, which means the whole bill would fall, all about that. And then they've stuck on the end of it a line about the grooming cases and the call for an inquiry. And the reason we heard about it so much is that Labour have decided that this is a big political thing, that they are trying to wreck a bill that's trying to deal with some of those Sarah Sharif issues because of this grooming inquiry call. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And oppositions tend to try to wreck bills that they disagree with.
And I would just say, though, that also I think what's going on with this bill tells us something about what a mess our politics are in, because the education policy that is enshrined in this bill is pretty important, right? So it does, not only does it remove that automatic transfer from local authority status to academy status for failing schools, but also it restricts powers of academies when it comes to, what they pay teachers. And therefore, this is in terms of education policy, this is a very important bill that barely hasn't got a look in terms of, public debate or public interest. And that in itself, I think, tells us something about
Which they, by the way,
how extraordinary our politics is.
Which they deliberately put out on the day of the sentencing of Sarah Sharif's father, so that we would all focus on the safeguarding aspects of the bill and not focus on the education
on a really important education policy.
I just want to put together a sort of coherent narrative to kick off a further discussion with both of you about what's happening with these requests or demands for a second inquiry. Kemi Badenoch, you will have heard there, asking Keir Starmer why he hasn't done it, why he didn't do more, him throwing back at her, and I thought she looked very uncomfortable about this, him saying, did you ever raise it in the House when you were a minister? Did you raise it when you were the children's minister? And obviously the answer to that, as far as I could discern it, was no. So let's just begin at the beginning with this. There is an accusation that lots of people didn't do enough over a great many years. There's an accusation that we in the media ignored it and covered it up, not to justify ourselves, but just for the purpose of trying to put together some coherent history about this. Yes, you could perhaps say we didn't cover it as early and as big as we should have done. Maybe all of the media was like that. You could say that about many stories. There are many stories competing for attention. But this was a headline sequence from a couple of years ago, which I just want to play as an indication of just how seriously we have taken the issue. Young girls driven around and offered to paedophiles. Children blamed for their own abuse. One, possibly several, murdered. A world in which such horrors were considered normal by the abusers, inevitable by the victims. Welcome to Telford, a name written in shame tonight, like Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham. With 1,000 child victims, it leaves one question above all. What on earth was going on in West Mercia Police?
We're sorry for failing to adequately protect.
Has anything really changed? I mean, as recently as 2018, one of your superintendents was saying there's no discernible problem in Telford.
Things have changed, so we fail to appreciate the scale of the problem.
Okay, that was a section of the beginning of the programme that night from a few years ago. Look, the reality is this is a problem that has had quite a lot of attention episodically, and we did have these recommendations for action, which the Tory government, did not implement. Jess Phillips was one of those, as we said earlier, campaigning for it. Keir Starmer was, the senior prosecutor. And now we get to a position where I think what you could justifiably say to the Labour Party is, well, as you said earlier, you've been in power 6 months and you haven't implemented them yet. We've debated that and we can debate that some more. But fundamentally, now we've got the leader of the opposition and people who were in that government jumping on a bandwagon created by Elon Musk. And I just think that's very, very uncomfortable, isn't it? And I must say, I thought Kemi Badenoch kind of looked uncomfortable doing it. And I don't understand the strategy behind it and what the upside is for the Tory party.
I mean, there is obviously this huge question of why now. And there's kind of both things are true, right? The scandal was terrible and was covered up to some extent over time. It was first emerging in 2002, 2004. Labour MP Ann Cryer was raising issues about it. The Times did the odd story. They then did this big investigation in 2011. We waited years longer for a national inquiry, and that national inquiry was broader. It was into child sexual exploitation. There have been, and I should say I've spoken to a lot of people who have campaigned in all these areas. These local inquiries, Rotherham, Telford, Oldham, are seen as very effective. In Rotherham, I think it cost a couple of £100,000, and immediately everything was implemented and it made a massive difference. And speak to people in Rotherham, they would say that. The Alexis J National Inquiry, she also actually did the Rotherham inquiry, cost over £100 million. And as you say, we're still waiting for some answers. So I do think, why is it coming up now? Partly because online, this issue has become a massive recruitment tool for the far right. That's why, you know, someone said to me, Elon Musk is like patient zero of the X algorithm. He's actually seeing all this stuff come back to him because of the algorithm. And obviously, he has led to this situation where the Tories have called for an inquiry. Obviously, that is political opportunism to an extent. But is there an argument that there should be a national inquiry specifically on this? Alexis Jay clearly made massive recommendations that haven't been put into place. What people who are calling for an inquiry would say is it didn't address all of the issues that specifically relate to the grooming gangs where a number of the perpetrators were of Pakistani heritage. For example, the issue that Kemi Badenoch was raising in the House of Commons today, the kind of argument which was, do we understand why people, you know, why the ethnicity matters? Do we have enough data on ethnicity? And so I think you have to try and separate it out in a way. I think it is absolutely true that it is ridiculous that the Alexis Jay recommendations haven't been acted on, and that a number of them would have helped with this particular scandal. For example, data collection. I tried to get the data on the ethnicity of perpetrators the other day. It's all self-reported. Only a third of people report. Of that third, 83% are white, 7% are Asian, but we don't know what the other 2/3 are doing. And in the meantime, we've got all of this happening online. But I do think it's important that Alexis Jay herself, who, by the way, did the Rotherham report, so therefore understands this issue better than almost anyone, thinks that we do not need another inquiry, because it's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to take a lot of time.
I mean, so if one were going to give... you know, benefit of the doubt's not quite the right way of putting it, but if one was going to at least pick up one aspect of what Badenoch said versus Starmer that it seemed to me didn't get properly answered, he kept saying that you know, a new review would take, or based on precedent, another 7 years or something. Well, I mean, two things. One is it's not obvious that it would necessarily take 7 years, although actually, you know, my experience of these things, just look at Hillsborough, for example, another very sensitive issue. These things almost always take longer than you think. So even if she says short. But the thing I didn't really understand today is why neither. She seemed to accept, because she didn't challenge it, what Starmer was saying, which is if you do another inquiry, then Alexis Jay's recommendations can't be implemented. But that just seems to me to be a logical fallacy. I don't remotely see why a new inquiry... You know, there's two separate issues. One is we need the 20 recommendations implemented. And let's be absolutely clear, some of them this government will not like because they will involve potentially paying quite a lot of money to victims at a time when this government hasn't got any money, right? So, you know, let's just see how fast they implement everything that Alexis Jay said. But, you know, I just don't see why, if we had another inquiry, and we may need one, why that remotely has an impact on pushing through these very important recommendations. So I do think Starmer's defence on that is a bit weird. However, I would say two other points, right? We know about the scandal of a bit, we may not know enough, right, about the scandal of these grooming gangs from people of Pakistani origin. Well, you know, and arguably we should know more about it, right? But what about the systemic paedophilia in our fee-paying schools, where we know there were networks of teachers who were supporting each other for years, abusing little boys? Why is there not a national public inquiry into that? Why isn't there a national public inquiry into the kind of things that we've been hearing about in the Church of England? You know,
which, of course, there is, because the Alexis Jay one was supposed to span all of this, and it was set up by the Conservatives.
But why aren't we getting? You know, but given that, you know,
because
the argument at the moment is each different category of victim deserves to be treated as a separate scandal, and they all, you know. But what my point is, and this is, I'm afraid, tells you something about just the nightmare of this scandal in this country. If you're going to have one for the grooming gangs, in my view, there should be a separate one for education. There should be a separate one for
one
Church of
we
England.
Can probably all agree on is that, yes, you might be accused, Jess Phillips, the safeguarding minister, of not having acted quickly enough to implement these recommendations. She's been in office for more than 6 months now. I think we probably all agree that calling her a rape genocide apologist is about the most stupid thing anyone's said about British politics in the last decade, possibly longer than that.
From a man who does, as far as we can tell, has no track record in supporting the victims of sexual violence.
I mean, one could discourse at some level about the depth of ignorance of it, but what it did make me think is, and we talked about this a little bit on News at 10 this week when I was just asking you, it's not obvious to me. We've seen Mark Zuckerberg bending the knee in Facebook in the kind of most craven way I think I've almost ever seen. Nick Clegg's been booted out of Facebook, the guy who was...
He would say with agreement.
With agreement, fine. But with...
replaced by someone who's
but the
friendly
guy
with the
who
government.
persuaded Zuckerberg to do the fact-checking and everything else, that all the rest of it. Even Zuckerberg himself acknowledges that some bad is going to get out there, more or less his words, as a result of these changes. How does Starmer handle this? That's what interests me, because it's not obvious that bending the knee to Trump, as Trump seems to now demand of everyone in this very powerful second coming that he's got, it's not obvious that that's what Starmer's voters want to me. And I'm kind of interested to know how you both think he handles this.
It wasn't obvious that Tony Blair's voters wanted that either. But the reason the governments do it, the reason that we remain very close to the US, even when it seems... like we're doing things that may not be in our own interest, is because of all the important links, And those I've been speaking to loads of people in government over the last few days. Those important links remain, very, very key. And before last weekend, the instinct of them was to actually be really careful with this and not to go there and not to attack Elon Musk. I think the Jess Phillips stuff was what kind of crossed a line for them. And then over the weekend, they had these conversations about Keir Starmer coming out tougher, as he did in the press conference that Robert was at, and asked him a question about it. And the language was much stronger than anything we've heard before. But what they do think is and I think they may be complacent on this to some extent, they do think that everyone in Trump's orbit is not necessarily speaking for Trump. And they include Elon Musk in that, and they include the guy who called incoming Ambassador Peter Mandelson a moron, and they are watching very carefully to see what Donald Trump actually thinks about all of it. And it was notable that when Donald Trump came out to speak this week, that he didn't amplify what Elon Musk was saying, and he seemed to be suggesting that Elon Musk was just talking about some people who are running for office. They could be complacent because Elon Musk remains incredibly close to Donald Trump.
You hit on a number of important points. One of them is Tony Blair made the calculation, which I think was correct, even given the appalling mess he made of the Iraq war. He made the correct, I think, calculation that most Labour voters don't want anti-Americanism from a Labour leader, right? And I think that is a big fact of British politics, that if you want to be the party of government, you do not engage in the kind of rhetoric that Jeremy Corbyn engaged in, which was basically anti-Americanism. And one of the reasons, many people, at the top of the Labour Party now think that one of the reasons Corbyn was never electable was because of the way that he could not hide his antipathy for so much that America, even without Trump, sort of represents, right? Now, the really interesting question for me is whether with somebody in the White House who is sort of implying that he's prepared to go to war to take Greenland and the Panama Canal, and sounds sort of implies he's slightly Putinesque in terms of his imperial ambitions, whether actually the calculation, the electoral calculation changes. Whether at that point a Labour Prime Minister has to say, hang on a second, even core traditional patriotic Labour voters won't like this. And therefore there is a really interesting question to me about whether he will not, he got a bit of backbone and laid into Musk, even though he didn't actually name him. It was obvious he was attacking Musk. It'll be very interesting to see whether he will be able to sustain this very friendly approach that he takes to Trump. But then separately from all of this, I'm slightly bemused in some ways by Badenoch's repositioning on the back of essentially a political gambit stunt by Musk himself. She looks as though she's trying to suck up to Musk. And I can tell her now via this podcast, there is literally zero chance that at any point Musk will endorse the Tory party. It is not going to happen, right? I know enough people close to Musk to know that there is no world in which Musk is going to say to his 211 million followers, I really like the Tory party, ever. So what the hell she thinks she's doing is beyond me.
Well, I think the Nigel Farage thing shows that you've got to be very careful. You suck up to him, and then the next thing he tweets how much...
We better wind up, but one question very, very briefly. Obviously, gilt prices have spiked to a very high level, means borrowing from the markets to fund our spending is just getting more expensive. Speculation that Rachel Reeves might have to cut public spending or raise taxes further. The last thing anyone listening to this or watching this wants to hear for sure. What do you both think about that?
Well, just very briefly on that, I mean, one of the things that I was literally staggered by, I don't think it was mentioned by a single MP today. It wasn't mentioned by Kemi Badenoch. But I thought some Tory MP, this is not a secret, right? But, yesterday, the price of borrowing for 30 years for the government, long-term borrowing, rose to a level, the interest rate it has to pay rose to a level we haven't seen, I think, since 1998. This morning, the amount the benchmark gilt price, the benchmark bond, that's borrowing for 10 years by the government, that rose to levels we haven't seen since 2008. On the basis of those interest rates, Rachel Reeves no longer has any headroom. At this particular point, she hasn't got a budget coming up, so it doesn't matter this second, but it will matter. At this particular point, she is in breach of her fiscal rules. And at this particular point, if there was a budget tomorrow, she would have to raise taxes or cut public spending. Unless she were to ditch her fiscal rules. I mean, it's just astonishing to me. Nobody mentioned that in the House of Commons today. Astonishing.
Which throws their entire long-term strategy into flux, because what they want is to have done all the bad stuff in 2024 and then to have happy days ahead. And the reality of the economic situation means that could be very difficult.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us, whether you were watching or listening. Remember, you can view new episodes on ITVX every Wednesday. And if you're enjoying it, please do hit subscribe on your favourite podcast platform to ensure you won't miss out on an episode.